Hello, everyone. Hi, such an honor to be with you today. And I'm just wondering, did anyone catch the last session on Hope is the Antidote? Like, who is feeling more hopeful right now? Because I know I absolutely am. That was incredible. So it's well known that when you have difficult things to say, it's best to pepper it with jokes so that people's defenses are lowered, and then they can more easily take in the tough stuff, right? And I just want to apologize off the bat that I am no humor writer, so there will be no jokes in today's presentation, at least not on purpose, but I do promise that there is a gritty kind of hope in what I have to say. So let's just start with where we are climate-wise, because this July, Earth had the hottest day, week, and month on record in 120,000 years, which makes it a ripe time to explore the often ignored mental health emergency within the climate emergency that unfortunately will distress and traumatize billions of people if leaders do not make deep-seated changes to how the mental health of their populations is cared for and protected faster and more effectively than has ever been done before. So I wanted to start with just a quick show of hands in here. How many of you have ever lost sleep with worry about the climate crisis, thinking about what it means for you, perhaps your children, other loved ones? Yeah. And how many of you have ever felt a pang of grief for the up to 1 million species that scientists tell us we are pushing to extinction by the end of the century? Yeah, we're in good company. Me too, on both of these accounts. Now, these are appropriate emotional responses to the troubled state of the world. And while the distress that they cause can overwhelm us at times and threaten mental health, multiple studies show that climate distress, while often negatively associated with well-being, is positively associated with climate action. And it's been suggested that this might actually be a crucible through which we as a people have to move in order to get serious about our role in bringing about, and I quote, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, which is what the latest UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report has told us is needed to prevent truly catastrophic warming for humanity as a whole. So to understand why I say this, let's back up and look at how climate change impacts mental health. It does this through multiple pathways. So first, there's direct and indirect stressors. There's the hurricanes, the wildfires, the floods that we see around us, right? And they can cause disruptions to necessities like food and work and shelter. We see that this can lead to clinical levels of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, maladaptive coping with substance abuse, domestic abuse, and suicidality. And extreme heat, which is the deadliest of disasters, is associated with aggression, violence, self-harm in some cases. And the psychological impacts of disaster have been found to be 40 to 1 in terms of the ratio of outweighing the physical impacts of disaster. Then there's physical health. And climate change, it makes us sick, full stop. It affects our nutrition and air quality, the spread of vector-borne diseases, and more. And as we get physically sicker, our mental health can suffer. So, for instance, asthma, which is made worse by the burning of fossil fuels that pollute the air, is linked with an increased risk of anxiety and depression. And then, and I expect this will be a surprise to absolutely no one here, the constant barrage of bad news about the climate crisis, the trends, and what may lie ahead is stoking mental and emotional distress around the world. But we are not all equally vulnerable to these impacts. So the populations hit hardest and first include children and young people who must confront a very uncertain future that understandably provokes some anxiety and whose developmental immaturity makes them especially susceptible to various physical climate impacts. And women who, for example, may experience gender-based violence when migrating or in disaster settings. And then people on the front lines of disaster who are predominantly in the global south, as well as people who can't evacuate quickly, which endangers the elderly, the poor, and those living with disabilities, people with pre-existing mental illness who are 2 to 3 times more likely to die in a heat wave, folks who experience a lot of discrimination, which can affect the aid that they receive in disasters, such as LGBTQ+ people, those living in close relationship to landscapes that are changing, such as ranchers and farmers and other outdoor workers and indigenous peoples worldwide. And lastly, the frontline climate professionals, so our climate scientists, journalists, green policymakers, activists, because there can be a serious psychological toll that comes with studiously bearing witness to the breakdown of a safe climate in one's day job and constantly having your warnings go ignored by power holders. So crucially, it isn't just that climate stressors, they threaten life and livelihood and therefore mental health. It's also that as these events traumatize individuals and overwhelm communities and stress our health systems, our ability to stop and slow climate change by transforming the complex systems in which we're living gets weakened, because how battered we feel determines how well we can build a new world. And so what we're dealing with here is a vicious cycle that we need to pay attention to. And in recent years, new words have emerged to describe people's emotional response to changing environmental conditions, such as solastalgia, which is homesickness, when you are still at home after so much negative environmental change has happened there that you no longer recognize it as home, and it doesn't give you comfort anymore. This is similar to what's being felt by Inuit communities in Canada's circumpolar north, who describe a type of ecological grief because, as self-proclaimed people of the ice, their identity and traditions are being taken by them by forces not of their own doing, as they are not the most responsible for warming of the atmosphere with their lifestyles, as the ice melts away for bigger and bigger chunks of the year annually. So perhaps you've heard of climate anxiety. Now, this is a term that's out there being widely used, but rather imprecisely, to describe a grab bag of difficult emotions that a person can experience when confronting the climate crisis: worry, angst, terror, fear, dread, sometimes even guilt. And despite the clinical sounding name, many researchers and clinicians have stood up to say that this is not a mental disorder and should never be considered a pathology, because the fear that it embodies is actually a reasonable and appropriate response to external sources of danger, such as still rising emissions, still expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, and inadequate action from leaders to do what the science says must be done to safeguard a climate in which humans can thrive, and of course the more than human world as well, which we are affecting, which has understandably started making millions of people around the world feel what the sociologist Anthony Giddens calls ontologically insecure. So in other words, climate anxiety is a caring response for everything that climate change is disrupting. And ideally, it can help us mobilize some resources towards fending off the danger. But it gets complicated and muddied pretty quickly in the available scientific literature. So as I mentioned, multiple studies have shown climate anxiety is positively associated with climate action, pro-environmental behavior. It seems to be able to startle us, to get us to sit up straight, reassess how we're living, realign our actions with our environmental values, which can bring some relief. The Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, for instance, she's very open about having gone through an extreme period of climate distress before then kicking up a global movement of students striking for climate action, in which she found a caring community that she says was very healing for her. But climate anxiety has also been found to, for some people, become so overwhelming that it impairs their functioning. And it's been linked to panic attacks, sleep problems, suicidality, and even eating disorders, where a person may become so captured by their thought of having a negative carbon footprint that impacts the planet that they stop eating any food that carries a carbon footprint at all. And unsurprisingly, pre-existing anxiety is found to be linked with climate anxiety, because if you're a very anxious person, the climate crisis is also going to add to that. But studies have also shown that a history of clinical anxiety is not necessary to experience significant levels of climate anxiety. And for some, the mere approach of distressing feelings about the climate crisis can cause a person to stick their head in the sand and do whatever they can to avoid the topic of climate change because they can't tolerate the feelings that follow their awareness. But of course, when we don't face it, we don't act. No one has ever won a war or responded effectively to an emergency by suppressing the recognition of a threat in order to maintain a certain level of comfort. But this kicking the can down the road is exactly what our institutions have been doing on the climate crisis for decades. And as psychologists, you have a critical role to play in helping people face and sit with the pain of climate reality, at the same time as helping them be well enough to function and to take action with others that can indeed prevent the worst outcomes. And to do this well in the clinic, a growing community of climate-aware therapists tell us that we need to know how to care for our own climate distress too, because as care providers, we are just as vulnerable to the same climate crisis that clients are so anxious about. So in order to understand how the climate crisis was psychologically affecting young people around the world, my colleagues and I surveyed 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds in diverse settings from India, Nigeria, the Philippines, France, Finland, the US, and so on. And we were alarmed by what we found. 45% of youth globally said that their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis are interfering with daily life tasks, eating, sleeping, concentrating, and this jumped to 70% as an average for the global South countries where we surveyed. 75% of youth said that the future is frightening to them. 56% said that they feel humanity is doomed, and 39% said that they feel hesitant to have their own kids one day because of the climate crisis. Now, these thoughts and feelings were also significantly associated with a sense of being failed by leaders and lied to by governments. And in a different study, this time of 3,000 16 to 25-year-olds in America, we found that those who report having been exposed to at least one climate hazard are significantly more likely to factor climate change into their future planning and thinking, affecting their thoughts around travel, because many want to see places before they expect they'll disappear, ideas about planning for education and the workforce in order to prepare themselves for a climate-changed future in ways that their schooling is not currently addressing, as well as whether or not to have children. Much more research is needed to understand if any of this could be hinting at emerging trends for our young people, and if so, the socioeconomic impacts could be significant, given that kids born today already face up to 7 times the number of disasters than their grandparents did. And it looks as though hazard exposure may influence how they think and feel about the most fundamental and intimate decisions of their lives. Now, some young people are leveraging their climate anxiety explicitly for political change. Undergraduate students in Canada created the No Children, No Future campaign to tell their leaders that they are refusing to have children until governments make it safe for them to do so with adequate climate action. It was online for only a short period of time, but in that window, garnered more than 10,000 signatures from young people all over the world. But it's a mistake to think that it's only youth who feel this distress. In a study of 4,000 people with a nationally representative sample in terms of gender and age distribution across the world's top 4 emitters, so China, India, the US, and Japan, researchers found China and India to have the highest climate anxiety scores, with over 20% of Chinese and 30% of Indian respondents saying that they sometimes or frequently experience functional impairment from their climate anxiety. Now, the good news is that there's a ton that we can do to protect and promote mental health in our warming world. We can really take this vicious cycle that I was talking about and turn it into a virtuous one by enacting programs and policies that have win-win solutions for both problems of climate and mental health at once. So for example, by increasing the provision of green spaces in urban heat islands, more carbon dioxide is absorbed by trees, which provide shade that protect residents from extreme heat. And at the same time, mental health benefits by giving people the opportunity to connect with nature that they otherwise can't in the places where they live, which helps with stress management and simultaneously mitigates against extreme heat's bad impacts on sleep and mental health. And as many of you will know, social cohesion is a huge win-win for all aspects of living as humans on this planet. The potential of social relationships to allow residents in a community to coordinate their efforts and achieve shared goals is what's known as social capital. And people with high social capital and connectedness and high social trust, they tend to rebuild faster after disaster has visited their community. And crucially, they show significantly lower levels of mental disorder in the aftermath of the adversity. In one Australian study, a cyclone had ripped through a neighborhood and tore the roof off of children's homes, and they found that kids in the local school who had the most others in their lives to talk to trust, to rely on, to feel safe with, they had significantly lower post-traumatic stress disorder scores than the most socially isolated kids in the community. And in order to make the task of cultivating social capital something that explicitly supports climate action, community members can be empowered to identify and work on climate mitigation problems that they care about in the places where they live. So to go back to that example, by figuring out how to roll out a tree planting project in an urban heat island that protects residents from extreme heat and absorbs carbon dioxide, neighbors learn the skills of how to lead, how to follow, how to trust each other so that if and when a disaster does occur, their preventive and protective social infrastructure is more firmly rooted in place. And this all sounds pretty simple. It is, but at a time when loneliness has emerged as a public health epidemic in this country and more people are living alone now than ever in human history, this isolation, this fragmentation, the loneliness we see in our society is actively standing in the way of how well we can prevent trauma from climate events. So we can help people move away from individualism towards distributed collective power by working together at a local level and understand, knowing that it's a key mental illness prevention strategy. And of course, some trauma and distress, it's going to need to be responded to, can't all be prevented. The problem is, as we see, many industrialized nations already can't meet the need for care that their citizens require. And in many lower resource nations, the specialist care is just completely lacking or not sturdy. The mental health fallout from COVID really made that clear to us. There just aren't enough clinicians, and the biomedical model is falling short. Now, fortunately, we have solutions that have a lot of great evidence behind them from global mental health, where we see that lay people and community health workers can be trained by specialists who step out of the role of care provider and they become the educator to pass on interventions for challenges like anxiety and depression, and are given to people in the community who, even though they don't have any former training or psychological expertise, clinical trials show that when they go out into their neighborhood and they administer these simplified interventions, they can be even more effective at helping people recover than primary care. And wow, how exciting. That is amazing. Why are we not looking to roll that out pervasively in the climate crisis when it's available? And yet, who in positions of power is talking seriously about this? There is the new Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act that has just been proposed to Congress if anyone does want to look at ways that they can endorse that, which really follows this logic. It's quite exciting. And of course, the really big thing that I just want to underscore that's going to help prevent climate-related mental health challenges from spreading is serious addiction to quit, serious energy to quit our addiction to fossil fuels, because there's no such thing as coping if we keep feeding what is causing more ferocious disasters and migration crises that will cause human suffering at a scale that we haven't seen before for a kind of global perspective. But while we're still working to transition to a clean energy economy in ways that are fair and just, there's a lot that we can do to help ourselves out by identifying and amplifying resilience-building protective factors. So those that jump out as especially useful in the climate crisis are decolonial by nature, because they act as antidotes to the colonial systems that enable the climate crisis, including capitalism, the extraction and commodification of nature, and white supremacy, which makes the most damaging impacts of the climate crisis so unequally felt across our communities. As Hop Hopkins of the Sierra Club puts it, we will never survive the climate crisis without ending white supremacy, because you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. That's why, in addition to traditional clinical tools, which are super important here, we need to uplift non-biomedical approaches in the Climate Mental Health Resilience Toolkit that speak to people's diverse cultures, beliefs, abilities. This includes things like working with spiritual leaders, religious communities, mindfulness, meditation, drawing strength from one's ancestors, indigenous wisdom traditions, working in groups and at low cost, using forest bathing and nature immersion to be able to calm the nerve and regulate the nervous system, storytelling that supports self-efficacy and flexible thinking beyond these rigid black and white categorizations that we see all the time of, are we hopeful or are we doomed? And the ability to not see adversities as dead ends, but instead to see them as edges upon which to practice new things with others, to learn and to grow, and this growth mindset, as psychologists know it for, helps people find hope in dark times. It always has. It's evident in the histories of so many communities that have survived existential threats before. As the scholar of climate colonialism, who's a Nigerian American named Olufemi Taiwo once said to me in an interview, yes, tomorrow looks dire, but my ancestors dealt with the transatlantic slave trade and Jim Crow and colonial apartheid. And while what's happening today is neocolonial and not in any way just, it is in fact not as bad as things have been for us. And so there's this kind of sky is falling mentality that gets precluded from that political position. So I will be honest with you that the reason why I now do this work at all is because there was a time when I was so stressed out about the climate crisis that internal peace was rather scant. And I thought, yeah, maybe the sky is falling. Back then, I was working as a science communicator, and super scary writing was coming across my desk every day about the climate crisis, the stuff that nightmares are made of, and then I'd go home and my partner and I would talk about whether or not we wanted to try and have a baby. But given the data that I was immersed in every day and massively hardened by the inaction we were seeing from nations, from leaders worldwide, I found this question tormenting, and it really unleashed a lot of climate anxiety and grief within me that started impacting my ability to concentrate and getting in the way of some of my relationships. And I felt alone, I felt angry, I felt despairing. But it wasn't long before statistics and campaigns emerged to show me how many other people were also being driven mad by the state of climate affairs. Now, it didn't take long for me to see that it is a privilege to dread the future when so many who've long been marginalized already acutely fear the present and deserve and need psychosocial support for the disasters that are on their doorstep. Anxiety of people like me and what we call the global north is of course not the same as disproportionate climate trauma that we already see in the global south. But it can be a gateway to solidarity with the most climate vulnerable communities when it causes privileged people to take a step back to reassess a sense of implication in this crisis and the opportunity to act and bring about change, and understand, importantly, why climate nihilism or a doomer attitude is never viable. As the paleoecologist Jacqueline Gill likes to say, the climate crisis is not a pass-fail test. There's never a moment at which we are doomed and action doesn't matter anymore, even if we blow way past our 2030 Paris Agreement goals, which it looks like we might, because preventing every 1/10 of a degree of warming supports the survival of millions. So the distress that I experienced led me to write a book called Generation Dread, which explores the emotional and psychological toll that climate and environmental chaos is already exacting, and ways to get out from under that burden by thinking differently about mental health protection and promotion in a warming world. And I feel icky saying this, but the organizers told me to remind you that it is available for purchase in the new book title showcase outside of the registration area. So in the last few years, in response to a rising need, a plethora of climate-focused mental health supports and casual and formal psychosocial supports have gotten off the ground. These include things like climate cafes, a decentralized network of meetings where people can show up and have frank conversations about how the climate crisis is making them feel, why, and what they can do about it, as well as climate-aware therapists who are organized in places like the Climate Psychology and Climate Psychiatry Alliances, who take a non-pathologizing approach to this clinical work, as well as peer support programs like the Good Grief Network, who have a 10-step program modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous for helping people understand and soothe their climate anxiety and distress in community, and then by the end of the program, figure out how to reinvest the energy they've lost from being stressed out into meaningful and purposeful actions at this time. And the way that people move through climate anxiety and grief has been mapped by a Finnish researcher named Panu Pikula. He shows that people often move through a state of semi-consciousness of how bad the problem is to an awakening moment. And when they absorb the truth, it can be so profoundly disturbing, the implications of climate science, that it causes a shock response. And from there, people might throw themselves into activism, but then burn out if they don't have the right internal supports, or get lost in grief, which can sometimes lead to depression, or suppress their feelings in a desperate move to avoid the problem from entering into their consciousness at all. But of course, that suppression then puts more stress on the body and is not healthy long term. So Dr. Piccola found that it's only when people learn how to integrate bits of all three components by aligning their environmental values with their actions, alongside appropriate engagement with the regulation of difficult emotions and healthy amounts of distancing from the problem, which is not so much avoidance now as conscious forms of self-care that then they adjust and transform in a process of learning to live with the climate and ecological crises in a way that can protect their well-being. And my team and I in Stanford Medicine's new initiative on climate change and mental health are working to accelerate a movement that brings a community-minded and public health approach to rising climate mental health challenges, to improve our collective human capacity to also mitigate and adapt to the worst outcomes that happen with our warming atmosphere. And we're researching how to implement community-based healing interventions that build resilience, as well as educating and empowering clinicians about their roles in helping to bring those forth. And as you can imagine, partnerships is the name of the game in this work, so we really hope that if this interests you, you will get in touch and join us. And in one project with our partners in Lagos, Nigeria, London, UK, and here, but in New Orleans, we bring groups of youth and elders together for intergenerational climate conversations that are facilitated by community leaders, where they unpack how the climate crisis is showing up in their communities, how it's impacting their mental health, and how they want to be supported. And we're finding that it not only seems to be a therapeutic experience for all of the ages, but that people start naturally using it as a space to seed ideas for community organizing and the actions that they can take as next steps. So we're looking to scale this model to other hubs and build in mental health supports when particular needs arise. So the climate crisis is anthropogenic, right? We hear this all the time. It is caused by human behavior, and yet, where have the behavioralists been, the psychologists been all of this time at the decision-making tables around global solutions? It is absurd that psychological insights have mostly been overlooked for decades, while instead we've been talking about the crisis in terms of gigatons and graphs and carbon taxes and technologies, by the way, amid a backdrop of confusing industry-concocted denial. And just look at where all of that has gotten us, right? So the time for psychology in climate is now. Yes, to help people recognize greenwashing, to help us make more sustainable decisions in our society, but also for more effective community organizing from a place of shared grievances. Because by talking about what you're losing and what they're losing and what I'm losing and what keeps us up at night, how that feels, the emerging social norms and research around climate distress can help us open up what millions of us are feeling within us, whether we are acknowledging or not at some level, creating a tremendous opportunity for solidarity and collective action. And I was told that this is a science summit, so I should really downplay theory in my talk, and I didn't take that advice too strictly, because I don't think that science is the only thing that we need to tap at this time to bring on urgently needed solutions, and nothing can explain why I believe that better than this quote who comes from the environmental historian and lawyer Gus Speth. And he says, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." There is a lot of truth in that quote. But of all the kinds of scientists that there are out there, you psychologists, surely, are the ones who know the most about how to bring on cultural and spiritual transformation, and who know the most about how to appeal to people's wisdom over the desire for profit or convenience. And you have a unique and indispensable role to play. You're being called to earnest in this work. I dearly hope that you can feel your unparalleled relevance here and have received your invitation. So I will leave you with a call to action. Because the world has successfully used treaties in the past to manage major global threats, from nuclear weapons to landmines to repairing the hole in the ozone layer. And now there is momentum building behind a new call for a global treaty to end the expansion of coal, oil, and gas projects. And this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty has issued a health letter which has been signed by the World Health Organization and hundreds of medical institutions around the world. So to prevent population mental health from worsening in the climate crisis, you can add your support at fossilfueltreaty.org/health-letter. Thank you so much.